To make something complicated is simple. To make something simple is difficult. Spragen. Hi, Misha here, and we're kind of continuing on with Dog Days of Summer, August. And I just felt like talking about the evolution, the development of the Soviet submachine gun. And this will be two parts. Part 1, we will talk about the PPD, and I do actually have a PPD to show you, and the PPSh-41. And then in Part 2, we'll of course talk about the PPS-42 and 43, and also some foreign things and facts and uses, and just kind of miscellaneous. I don't know, felt like fun. Just something to do. The only two nations to have a submachine gun in World War I were Germany and Italy. Although the U.S. was working on, rather Thompson himself was working on his gun, it would not be available till afterwards. This is kind of important because the 1920s, everyone looked into the concept of a pistol caliber select fire or just automatic gun, but they didn't really know what to do with it. They knew it was kind of there, but it was always a background thing, if that makes sense. And of course, interwar spending in the 20s was pretty low-key, and in the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks were still regaining power, and this was one of their favorite guns, the Su-96 broom handle, in 7.63 by 25 Mauser. This one's a red 9, but theirs were in that 30 caliber Mauser round. And the handful of those they had, plus the Nagant revolver we've talked about, were their standard sidearms. And they were looking at SMGs, but it was mostly kind of a weekend hobby deal, I guess. Fyodor Tokarev did make some early prototypes. In fact, they were kind of using the 7.62 by 38 Nagant round. It was modified. It was not the same. That would have been horrible, but that's what he had to work with. Others were working with the 7.63 Mauser round, including Vasily Diktorov, who we talked about his RPD last year, his flapper system. And in 1929, his first small caliber, pistol caliber chambered concept gun was really just a scaled down DP, which used the same kind of flapper systems we saw in the later RPD. This wasn't really going to go anywhere, and I think Diktorov knew this. It was just getting his toes in the water. It would have been far too expensive, and you didn't need a locked breech for a submachine gun. Beginning in the summer of 1930, various communist boards and commissions started looking at domestic submachine gun designs, and there would be multiples, and there's now a kitten pawing at my feet. Yeah, Ragamuffin had kittens. Great. Before we go any further, any support you can give just watching these videos, because they're just kind of low-key, hanging out, beating the heat, liking, sharing with a buddy maybe. Or if you want, you can do a super thanks or visit Patreon, but it's absolutely not required. They would look at Diktorov's locked breech design. They were kind of narrowing down on the Mauser cartridge, which is good. And soon they'll say, look, we're thinking 3 to 3.25 kilograms, automatic fire at close range. They still really don't know what they want. And in 1930, they're very clear that none of the designs they looked at were ready to go. But it let them kind of further refine what they did and didn't want, and try to refine the tactical doctrine a bit more. This also let Diktorov refine his design. First, he would go to kind of an agitated or delayed blowback, dropping his true locked breech in 31, and then he would go to just a straight blowback, very much inspired by recent designs from Germany, like the MP-28 Bergman, and what was developing at the time in Finland from Lottie, the just about to be adopted KP-31, but of course this too was the final version of something Lottie had been working on since the 20s. It's all this late first generation style with a machined receiver, a jacket, a relatively long barrel. Most of this generation it's 10 to 12 inches on the barrel. Relatively low capacity magazines we'll see, very adjustable sights, and fixed wood stocks. We'll look at the show me later on, you know why. 1932, they get more serious about trials. There's more of a formal commission set up, and 14 designs are looked at. The ones we really care about are Diktorov's and Tokarev's, and they really like Diktorov's better because it's cheaper to produce, at least it should be. It seems to be a little more accurate. It's a more straightforward, potentially more durable design. And it effectively wins. In January of 1933, it's approved for further study. And then it's official on May 17, 1934, that it will get the go-ahead for 100 samples, pre-productions to be made at the Kovarov factory, which was Factory 2 in Russia, which is actually where Diktorov worked at the time. So there you go. This is when the PPD, later known as the PPD-34, comes into its own. And believe it or not, I actually have one to show you this time. Here it is. I told you I had one. I never promised how big it was. It goes with the Russian soldiers from Joy Toy, little World War II soldiers. Yeah, they're fun. They're very, very mobile. They're the most flexible little guys I've found in the 1/18 scale. But yeah, there is a little PPD that came with them. So yeah, they approved a small rate production for testing, but they only made around 44, 45 that first year, and then about the same the second year, 1935, and they were officially accepted as the PPD in June. It was very low rate. They would hand them out to some border guards and NKVD units for field testing and feedback, and there is a constant process between 1935 and really 1938 refining the design. They do up production the next year to over 900, nearly 1,000, and then actually 1937 would be the highest rate at just under 1,300 made. But then 1938 it would slow down to just over 1,100 as they introduced change at the Kovarov factory, trying to get the design a little better. For what it's worth, it did really have a curved magazine. It was 25 rounds. It had a tangent rear sight out to 500 meters, had a barrel that was about 10 3/4 long with a machined jacket, wood stock, conventional. It was select fire. It did have a locking system on the bolt as a safety feature as well. Pretty conventional, relatively high quality. It took nearly 14 man-hours to make, and it cost around 900 rubles. And I know that doesn't really tell you anything, but I will say that a light machine gun was around 1,200 rubles. And that's actually the kind of basis of what would soon be its problems. But first, there would be a transitional series in 1938 leading into 39, and we get the PPD-34-38. Here it is in Ivan's hands. He actually really can pose these well. The 34-38 really went to address issues. Obviously, a lot had to do with trying to cheapen production, speed up production. For example, they changed the holes in the barrel shroud, but it was still machined. They did try to improve feeding and reliability by strengthening and just reworking how the magazine interfaced and all that. They also strengthened the stock, little changes like that, and these would bleed over into 1939. And then early in the year, seeing how much these were costing and not really knowing what to do with them, the People's Commissariat of the Defense basically put out a directive: stop PPD production at Kovarov and focus on other things more important. Keep in mind, this is right when they're trying to switch from the Mosin to the SVT system. It just, it seems ridiculous today, but it just wasn't a priority. That said, Diktarov was a friend of Stalin, so he very quickly approached him. And even though the Winter War is often credited with getting the PPD back in production by December of 1939, the truth is it was a combination of that and favoritism. Regardless, that year around 1,700 were turned out, meaning that all told, the two versions, you had fewer than 5,100, over 5,000. Not a big production number for Russia. But yes, the 38 was back in production as an emergency measure at the end of 39. And also they pulled a lot of guns that had been taken out of service back into service to use in the Winter War because they saw the effectiveness of what was happening with the Finns. They found some pretty interesting uses for their Suomi KP-31. And this is where the drum mag really comes into its own. Their version held 71 rounds of 9mm. Of course, Russia is using something different, and they very quickly adapted the PPD to take a dedicated 7.62-25 drum, but because of the stick mag and how the stock was, it had to have this long tower or neck on it, which did give them a capacity of 73 rounds, and it did mean the 34, 38 could use the 25 stick and the drum, but it wasn't ideal. It gave a really weird feed path, and it was obviously a stopgap measure. So Diktarov was already at work at Kovarov making the next version, which would be accepted in February, March of 1940, becoming the PPD-40. Now, a lot of changes were made to try to streamline production, save metal, save man-hours, but one of the biggest things with the 40 was using a drum like this. And you'll notice it just locks straight up in here to the receiver, no neck, no nothing. So the 40 used a 71 round drum without a neck. And since now the original stick mags really wouldn't work, the drum would become the standard for the Soviet submachine gun. In 1940, the Kovarov factory would produce about 81,000 submachine guns, including 38 and 40 model variants, and I don't think there's a breakdown, but this was the primary year of production for the PPD-40. It was always an interim solution, interim measure. It, by this point, was a good, reliable gun, but it was just too resource intensive and time consuming to mass produce. Also, it was pretty chunky, pretty heavy at about 3.5 kilos unloaded. It was looking dated. It needed replacement. Nevertheless, it was easier for the short term to go with the 40 until something better would come along. So in 1940, they announced they need a new submachine gun. It needs to be cheaper, faster to produce. It also needs to be able to build pretty much anywhere and distributed factories, kind of like the U.S. would do with the M1 carbine, if you think about it. You know, build bolts here, triggers there, barrels there. And so you don't see a lot from Diktarov at this point. He kind of drops out. And this is where we get Shpagin. He comes in, Georgy Shpagin. And he's a, interesting history on this guy. Shpagin was born at the dawn of the 20th century in 1897, and he was drafted for service in 1916 for the Great War, but because he had a crippled hand, he wasn't approved for frontline service. Probably a good thing considering how that went for the Russians, and would be assigned basically to work on firearms at a firearms workshop. He would be charged with repairing, refurbishing guns to get them back into the field, but he also got experience with captured and donated foreign arms, and this kind of sparked his interest in designing and seeing how things work. And he really, after the war and into the 20s, he became known for simplifying and just streamlining things, and he would be assigned to the Kovrov factory, Factory 2, during the Bolshevik era, so he would work close to and knew Tokarev and Diktarov, and so even though he didn't submit guns for the early 1930s trials, he was in that environment, and by 1940 he was ready to go because Shpagin had an idea. And that's exactly what they wanted, a new submachine gun. They didn't just want a simplified PPD. They wanted a design kind of loosely based around it, sure, familiar manual of arms, but something all new that was better suited to the Soviet Union at war. And now I can bring my carbine back out. What Shpagin thought of was, let's use simple sheet steel, stamped steel, folded steel, welds were possible. Let's cut down on the number of machined parts, and we're skilled labor, so pretty much any machine factory making anything can make most components. Let's cut down on man hours, yada yada yada, you get it. By August, September of 1940, he had his earliest prototype ready. He got the initial go-ahead, so Kovrov would build 25 guns for testing, which would be underway by October. Now, there were other competitors in the field, but the other of note was known as Shvatowny, and he had another submachine gun, pretty conventional, and it was found to be just as capable as far as the testing went. Both were tested in mud, dust. They were tested dry without lubrication, kind of different angles of fire, high, low, the usual things. The real maker came in November when they would do a 30,000 round endurance test split between self-loading semi-automatic and fully automatic modes. And here Shpagin's design really did well. It basically made it without any major breakages of note. At the end of the day, both technically passed, but Shpagin's design was considerably cheaper and faster to produce. It had only 87 parts and took, at the beginning, about 7.5 man hours per SMG to produce. Keep in mind that even after simplifications with the PPD, it was still over 13 man hours, and that's not even giving into the parts. The PPD had 90 some odd, even close to 100 parts if you count some of the earlier versions. So there you go. It was the winner. This battalion design was good, but it was just too resource intensive, too fancy. So the People's Commissariat of Defense officially approved it for adoption as the PPSh, as we say in English. SH is actually Shah in Cyrillic, so it's still just a single letter, but there you go. It's the difference between S and Shah. This would be on December 21st, 1940, and it's interesting. Even though this design was created in 1940 and tested and even approved in 1940, it would become known as the 1941, partially just to further separate it from the PPD-40, and also because they weren't ready to go yet. They knew that once they got up and running, they could make a lot more of these faster, but because it required stamping and they had been doing machining, they were going to need to set up production, and it was going to take some time. To that end, actually, PPD-40 production would continue into 1941, but really just using up existing parts. They made just under 6,000 that year. And I should point out that during the war, 42, 43, another 42, 43,000 PPDs would be assembled from leftover parts and, just whatever that brought the total PPD production to just shy of 129, 130,000 all told, with the vast bulk being the 40 variant. But yeah, by 1941, the PPD-40 was out, and the PPSh was in. So at this time, we just had some pre-production guns, test guns. There you have it. Very conventional. Overall length, of course, this one has an extension to make it 16 inches, which hopefully soon that won't be a factor anymore, but who knows. Originally, it had an overall length of about 33 inches with a barrel over about 10.5 inches, but it had this shroud. Now, it wasn't machined, it was basically very thick stamping, and it would go out a little further past the muzzle, and it was open top. This was an effective muzzle brake. Simple, cheap, but it worked. And they found that in testing, even though this has a pretty high rate of fire, 850, 900 rounds per minute, technically it was faster than even the PPD, which was around 750, 800, it produced better groups and accuracy. And of course it was select fire originally. This is a semi-auto YouTube with the selector switch here. You had a safety on the bolt here that could lock it into place. You see the notch back here. And originally, some of the concept versions would still have a tangent adjustable sight like the PPD, but very soon they would go just to 2-position 100, 200 meter rear, which is all you need. And I think originally the front sight was just kind of a simple bead. It didn't have the hood. I could be wrong on that. Simple wood stock. Even the receiver isn't truly a machined tube. It hinges open like this and was just a simple piece of steel here, basically a stamping, but much thicker, with your bolt in here, which of course your bolt is machined. Now this is a hammer fired gun. The originals would be open bolt, so that's different. So totally different mechanism and receiver system to the PPD. We do have storage in the stock for cleaning gear. See if I can get my finger in there. There you go. Sling mounts. And it used a 71 round drum, but not the same as the PPD-40. One neat feature is it has the mag catch here that folds down. Pop your drum out. This was kind of a system taken, and yeah, see? Taken from the SVT-40 because they were really worried about soldiers accidentally dropping mags. The drum was made from stamped steel too, of course. Originally they were a little bit thinner than later drums. And since this gun was designed from the beginning for it, a lot of the feed geometry and lips and everything were different. You can probably make a PPSh drum fit in a PPD-40, but something's getting modified. They're not just directly swappable, but it's just a matter of degrees and everything else. Notice this one's totally unloaded. And one neat feature, I think, about this mag catch system, it works better when you are loaded and in a better environment, but at least in theory, yeah, it did. It folds itself up when you put in a new feeding device. I don't know, it's a small touch, but I think it's kind of neat. Just like with my Stromy over there, this is a TNW one. Had it a very long time. It's phosphated. Originals would have just been kind of blued. And you can take the main pivot pin out if you need to. And there were a lot of minor variations in productions because from the get-go they planned to make these at different factories, and well, of course the war changed a lot of that too. Top ejection. To me, it's one of the most iconic SMGs of World War II, the Great Patriotic War, because Russia was as I said at the top of the video, the largest single user of submachine guns during the war, and this was absolutely the bulk of them. June 22, 1941, the Nazi Germans invaded Bolshevik Communist Soviet Union, and at first did very well. They pushed deep into Russia because they were not prepared. That's the whole story. Prior to that, in the spring, they were tooling up to make the PPSh, the PPSh-41, training workers, doing some pre-production runs. Actually, several high party officials were made in charge of getting things going. And there would be a whole new factory set up known as Factory 367, Zagorsk, right around Moscow. And then another factory would make drums, and then there would be several other factories being established too. But the truth is, the gun was not in service and even in regular production by June. So as Russia is retreating, even before production's underway at Zagorsk, they have to evacuate 367 that September, October. And it's a major undertaking. Several factories do get evacuated, and it's moved to a region known as Kirov, which is basically Vyatsky, which is what we know today is Molot, effectively, although that name wasn't used until much, much later. But that whole region, the whole industry was set up, and all the while, by November, they were able to make their first true production batch of PPSh-41s, and by December, they had made over 23,500 at the now relocated 367, and looking at other workshops and other factories throughout the USSR, they were able to turn out over 90,000 by New Year of 1942. Obviously, Shpaghin's concept is very scalable for mass production. It worked. Even though it took a full year to set it up, once it got going, it was very rapid, and that's exactly what the Russians needed. In other words, it was basically, to them, like the Sten was to the British, right at the same time. Because as we go into 1942, everyone's on the back foot, including the U.S. and the Pacific. Yeah, at this point, the Axis they're doing pretty good. Any sheet steel, tin cutting shop can make the receiver. It didn't require precision, anything. Trigger guard, same thing. The wood stock, it's wood. Anyone can carve wood. The only things that really needed precision were the bolt and the barrel. But those did not have to be made at a firearms plant. They could be made at, say, an automotive plant or a railway plant. Anyone who was used to precision machining, heat treating, keeping tolerances where they needed to be. The barrel, rather famously, could be made out of a Mosin blank. In fact, you could cut a blank Mosin barrel down to make two of these. Not saying that happened, I'm just saying it's possible. One thing this is famous for, it had a chrome line bore. At least the vast majority. It was intended to. Now, to be fair, the late production PPD-40s are sometimes reported with chrome-lined bores, but it was standard on the PPSh-41, which made sense considering the rate of fire, the environment. Why not? It made cleaning and it made life expectancy better. And, the bolt and everything had a fixed firing pin, single recoil spring, all that good stuff. Now, during the war, they would make further changes. As I said, it was about 7.6 man-hours to make these, 87 parts. Even early changes would get that down to near 7 hours, but when we get really deep into the war and with production really ramped up, it drops below 6 hours and gets close to 5.5 hours in some instances. 15 major factories, including Kovarov, would make these, with just literally countless subcontractors all throughout the USSR. And they did introduce streamlined productions of, for example, the stock. I'm opening it up to show you. This has kind of a fiber buffer in the back. But during the war, they'd make that out of anything, including leather or just compressed material, because it's a buffer. It just needed to keep the bolt from slamming into the rear here. There's a cross pin that holds this together and springs, so you don't want your bolt hitting that. So just anything would work. They also slightly updated and revised the magazine catch for better reliability. These would come out of the factory issued with 2 drums per SMG. And there would be a lot of variations. Sure, markings between factories would change, but during the desperate days of 1942, some would kind of do their own thing. Already by the spring of that year, they were making 3,000 PPSh a day, and by March, April, they had well over 100,000 in service, or 115,000, 120,000, and the number would just go up and up. In fact, by the end of the year, they had produced over 1.5 million, and they would keep this rate of production up through 1943 and 1944. Then in April of 1942, another important change, update, improvement is first introduced for this here gun, or rather reintroduced, a return to the curved stick mag. But of course this is not near the same as from the PPD-34, and it has a higher capacity. This was first seen April 12, 1942, but would take some time to get into production and service. And at first this might seem like a step back from a drum, but it really wasn't. Yes, this had a capacity of roughly 35 rounds, this of roughly 71. But soldiers often found with the drums it was better to download them 67, even 64, 65 rounds. Whereas these, they're better to top off. Also, where they were designed drums, so they'd fit some PPShs and not others. That's why they were serialized and the weapons were shipped with 2 right away. Again, they're pretty interchangeable, but the stick was supposed to be 100% weight too. Obviously, a fully loaded drum weighs more than a fully loaded stick, even 2 of them. They hang down a little more, but really it also came down to manufacturing. A stick mag, you have kind of this false tower here that's stamped around. It's all stamping. Originally it was a 0.5 mil stamping. Of course, just a regular spring. Note that this is a double stack single feed. That's just how it works here. But then you look at how a drum is created and the number of parts for it. You pop the face off here, and you know how these work. You stack your rounds in a circle, spiral, and then you wind it up. That was really good for keeping them compact, and it was pretty reliable, frankly. But it was absolutely more tedious and slower to reload compared to a stick mag, and there's just more to go wrong. And I think you know how I feel about drums generally. It's concept versus reality for the most part. But I fully admit that the PPSh-41 drum is one of the best, along with the Suomi's submachine gun drums. Certainly far better in execution and use than the Thompson, which is good because just because they developed the stick in 42, not all factories were ready to go. In fact, 367 didn't really start making the stick at full rate till 1943, meaning that for a time the drums are still shipping throughout 1942. And one final note, in late 1943 they would increase from 0.5 stamping, really on both, to about a 1 millimeter stamping, just to kind of keep dents away. Also, they would improve the spring. Some soldiers reported weak springs in their stick mags and feeding issues, so it wasn't like they went into service and were perfect. So there was a version 2 that started to appear in the field in 1944. And I think that's a good time to talk about service. For what it's worth, here are 2 drums and pouches, slightly different styles. Again, this is what was originally issued, and and then as the sticks would come along, they would come in a 3-cell pouch like this, and you would see mix. Some would have 1 drum and 1 pouch of sticks. Some would have 2 pouches of sticks and no drums, and some guys, even at the end of the war, still preferred just to go with the drum because in certain roles it made sense. So you see different loadouts. Here's another Joy Toy. This one holding their version of a PPSh. He does have little drum pouches on his gear there. Bedroll, alternative hat, kind of a summer wear. I don't know. Neat little things. The PPSh saw only limited use in 1941. Early production examples, pre-production, and these were in defensive fighting with retreat and reorganization. And when we get to the beginning of 1942, the Red Army only has about 55,000 SMGs in active service in the field. But this is going to go up very quickly. By mid-year, it's over 300,000, and when we roll over into 1943, it's over 700,000. And then we roll over to 1944, and it's nearly 1.5 million. I don't mean total production. I just mean, in combat, in the field. And the number would continue to rise as Russia would go on the offense. What did soldiers think of the new subgun? Honestly, they never had enough of the PPDs to get much of an opinion of them, and they did have a handful of Thompsons from the USA, a decent number, but they never had enough 45 ACP ammunition for them. And to be fair, 7.62 Tokarev is perfectly, ideally, uniquely suited, I've been talking a while, for submachine guns with a long barrel. The little bottlenecked round could really cook, even though it's just, 30 caliber bullet. In the beginning, with not many available, submachine guns, that was a little stiff, were kind of reserved for low-ranking officers that needed one, or NCOs commanding a small squadron group, special forces, reconnaissance scouts, and assault troops. But as production kicked up, first rifle divisions, rifle companies would get a couple each, but eventually you'll see entire rifle companies mostly equipped with SMGs, and this could even extend out to larger formations. And this is when use doctrine really evolves. To my mind, the PPSh is very closely ID'd with tanks, mechanized divisions, and you wouldn't always think about it, but a tank is very vulnerable to infantry and foot soldiers with satchel charges, Molotov cocktails, of course anti-tank armament, guns, rockets, whatever. So accompanying a tank with several submachine gunners to cover it and to mop up resistance and to go behind makes a lot of sense. And so you see a lot of them employed this way. Also, as tanks would come into towns where they couldn't maneuver, then these would kind of take point and get into urban fighting areas. That kind of crosses with assault troops, which combine with engineers for destruction. Sometimes they would have these to support engineers or other guys with like demolition charges, grenades, flamethrowers, that kind of thing, to assault bunkers, those kind of fixed fortifications. And then on the scout reconnaissance end, it made sense. The scouts tried to get in close without being detected, and having a high volume of fire gun to either make a surprise attack and get away with, kind of like the Finns did with the Suomi in the Winter War, or just to cover their own retreat, made a lot of sense. The Soviet naval infantry, the Marines, also used these, especially when they were going ashore, going into port cities and that kind of thing. It was closely ID'd with them. They found more and more roles and uses, but of course it wasn't perfect. It was a great weapon for close-in, high rate of fire. But it was a very high rate of fire. Like I said, 850, 900 rounds per minute. That meant you got 15, 16 shots in a single second burst there. And that meant you could empty a drum in 5-6 seconds and a stick mag in 2 or 3 seconds. So they did have to train guys to either use them on semi-auto and only do automatic when it really was necessary, or just keep control. Also, these were never known for being super duper accurate. They weren't inaccurate, but so they were only good 25 to 50 meters. Max range really about 100 meters. Maybe a good shot could do better in semi, but it's still an open bolt gun. That meant they needed to be supplemented by Mosin rifles or snipers or LMGs. It's all part of a thing, even though you will see basically entire companies armed with these. And they were very cost effective to produce. They didn't use a ton of steel. They could be made in 6 hours, as I said earlier. Easy to train soldiers on, easy to repair too. But they did have some flaws and faults and all that. I have one that comes to mind, even though it's an open bolt and that helps with cooling, and you do have a barrel shroud that's quite open. This is not a quick change barrel like on the Suomi. The Suomi, they usually had a couple of barrels, so if it got hot, they would just pull it off and stick it in the snow. Yeah, you can pull the barrel out of a PPSh, but it's not something you're doing in the field, so overheating, especially with the drums, was a concern, was a limitation. Because the receiver was stamped, it could be dented, bent more easily than a machine receiver, and because they were made during the wartime, stocks could and did split, crack, whatever, especially at the wrist. And that gets us into like QC. Obviously, this kind of ad hoc production and using parts from here and there and just the conditions. Yeah, some guns just had shit QC. What can you do about it? On the other hand, they really were easy to disassemble, clean, and maintain for the average soldier. Certainly more so than the SVT-40, which had some issues in the Red Army. And even if you had a receiver get bent, it could be straightened out at like a unit armor level. Stocks could be pinned or replaced. So a lot of those issues were repairable. And they were cheap enough that if a gun really just was kind of a bad egg, you could just toss it. A lot of times, though, when they were having feeding and jamming problems, it was either down to out-of-spec, substandard ammo, which, again, especially in the middle of the war, definitely happened, or poor magazines. As I said earlier, the original stick mag springs weren't great, and they were a little bit too thin steel so they could get dented. Same with drums. So if you had known decent ammo and a known decent magazine, most chances are the gun would run. Again, it was never super accurate, and it was never super light or short. 33 inches is not that short. And weight, well, it kind of fluctuated gun to gun, variant to variant, but 7 pounds unloaded. But you throw a drum in there, and it's well over 10 pounds. Actually, a lot of them are closer to 12 with a fully loaded drum because, sub-62 Tokarev is not light ammo. That was good when it came to recoil balancing, because with the high rate of fire, but it was also just bad for the load carried. So while they were good, they weren't ideal for things like paratroopers or people operating inside buildings. They were used like urban street fighting quite well, but inside a building they were a bit long and cumbersome. And they had the same issues that open bolts all did at the era of you could bump it and the bolt could come back far enough to take a round but not lock on the sear and then fire, although they're not near as prone to that as, say, the Sten. Should also mention one mechanical failure point seemed to be that sometimes an extractor could go bad. That just happens. Could be replaced, again, down to wartime QC for the most part. But no, most soldiers really like these. They had a generally very positive reputation, especially by 1944. when manufacturing quality is up and they've kind of worked out all the kinks with the magazines production, and as the Soviet Red Army is marching into Germany. So by 1945, millions were in the field, and production was high. Now, Russia would scale back production at some places on some guns beginning in January of that year. This is when you see the last SVT-40s. The PPSh was kind of kept at pretty high rates up until May. And then by June of 1945, production was really scaled back. They had turned out about 4.4 million during the war, with at least 2 million coming from the original factory 367. And they would make a few more, mostly just using up parts and giving workers something to do since they had the production lines. In 1946 and 1947, most people estimate around 500,000, give or take, bringing the total PPSh-41 production in Russia from 1941, though just barely, through 1947 to just under 6 million. Production was ended, of course, because newer guns were online. The SKS and eventually the AK, which was originally actually meant to be this gun's replacement, although, as we know, it didn't quite work out that way. But with so many in stockpiles, they were used for reserves, security guards, training, here and there, kind of backup guns, patrol sometimes, well through the 50s and 60s in the Red Army. In fact, after the war, mostly in the 1950s, there was a refurbishment and repair program. Guns that were just too far gone were scavenged for parts. Others that still had good receivers and barrels were put back up to a standard. This is where you see kind of the box with the hash through it. And while Russia would keep some, they would end up giving large numbers of these to communist supporting allies. You first see closely connected Eastern European nations by 1945, 1950, and then in the 50s you see these given away to Asian nations and even eventually some African and maybe even a bit of South American, but less so there. So it spreads about. I mean, with so many made, it's not going to go away quickly, and it worked. I mean, it lasted, so sure. But it was not the only submachine gun that the Red Army used in substantive numbers during the Great Patriotic War. In fact, as early as 1941, there was a need for something lighter, more compact, and even less resource intensive and time consuming to mass produce. With that, we end our first part. Next time, well, we'll pick up with the second part and talk about why a second SMG came to be that was never intended to really replace, but supplement, and why, of all people, Mikhail Kalashnikov considered it the best of all of World War